Made in America, the supply chain revolution. Textiles and trade, how clothing brands are shifting to domestic production. Introduction. The American textile and apparel industry, once a cornerstone of the nation's industrial might, has faced decades of decline due to globalization, low-cost overseas labor, and trade policies that favored imports. In the mid-20th century, nearly all garments sold in the U.S. were made domestically, but by 2015, 97% of clothing was imported, primarily from countries like China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. However, recent global supply chain disruptions, port delays, semiconductor shortages, trade wars, and geopolitical tensions, have exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on far-flung supply chains. Coupled with rising consumer demand for sustainability, transparency, and made in USA products, these disruptions are sparking a renaissance in American manufacturing, particularly in textiles and apparel. This episode of Made in America. The supply chain revolution dives into the textile and apparel sector, exploring how clothing brands are navigating the challenges of reshoring production to the United States. We'll examine the catalysts behind this shift, including the COVID-19 pandemic, trade policies like the USMCA, and technological advancements such as automation and microfactories. Through interviews with industry leaders, factory workers, and policymakers, we'll uncover the opportunities and obstacles in rebuilding a robust domestic textile supply chain. From cotton fields in the American South to cutting-edge factories in North Carolina and California, this episode tells the story of an industry at a crossroads, balancing cost, quality, and sustainability in a rapidly changing global landscape. The resurgence of American manufacturing is not just about economics, it's about national security, job creation, and environmental stewardship. As one industry expert notes, if we can't produce things like food, clothing, and shelter for ourselves in America, to me that's a matter of national security. This episode will explore how clothing brands are responding to consumer demand for ethically produced, sustainable garments, and how innovations like AI-driven sewing machines and textile recycling are reshaping the industry. We'll also address the challenges of high labor costs, limited domestic infrastructure, and the need for skilled workers, offering a nuanced look at whether Made in USA can become a reality again. The decline of American textile manufacturing. Historical context. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. was a global leader in textile and apparel manufacturing. The industry thrived on the backs of innovations like Eli Whitney's cotton gin and Francis Cabot Lowell's integrated textile mills, which marked the start of the Industrial Revolution in America. By the 1950s, American households spent nearly 9% of their income on clothing, almost all of which was produced domestically. Cotton from the South, spun into yarn in the Carolinas, and sewn into garments in urban factories fueled a robust industry that employed millions. However, the late 20th century saw a seismic shift. Trade agreements like NAFTA, 1994, and China's entry into the World Trade Organization, 2001, opened the floodgates to low-cost imports. Labor costs in countries like China and Bangladesh were a fraction of those in the U.S. A worker in Bangladesh earned in a month what a U.S. worker made in a day. As a result, U.S. manufacturers moved production overseas, leading to the closure of thousands of factories. Between 1990 and 2011, approximately 750,000 apparel manufacturing jobs disappeared in the U.S. By 2015, only 3% of clothing sold in the U.S. was made domestically, a stark contrast to the 50% in 1993. Impact of globalization. The shift to offshore production was driven by cost savings and efficiency. Large retailers like Walmart and fast fashion brands like H&M and Zara consolidated supply chains, favoring large overseas factories that could produce high volumes at low prices. This globalization reduced clothing costs for consumers. Americans now spend just 3.8% of their income on apparel, but it came at a cost. Domestic factories closed, and the U.S. lost critical manufacturing skills and infrastructure, creating a gap in the industrial commons needed to support apparel production. Case study: the fall of the Carolinas textile industry. The Carolinas, once the heart of U.S. textile production, were hit hard. Towns like Swainsboro, Georgia, saw textile mills shutter as companies moved to Asia and Central America. The loss of these factories devastated local economies, leaving behind unemployed workers and abandoned infrastructure. The decline also eroded training pathways for skilled trades like sewing and pattern making, making it difficult for the industry to rebound. Supply chain disruptions and the push for reshoring. The COVID-19 wake-up call. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of global supply chains. In early 2020, factory closures in China led to shortages of critical goods, from medical supplies to apparel. Port delays, shipping bottlenecks, and labor shortages further disrupted the flow of goods. For example, U.S. textile manufacturers faced delays in receiving raw materials, while apparel brands struggled with unpredictable demand and skyrocketing shipping costs. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported a 13% drop in textile and garment industry employment in 2020, highlighting the sector's vulnerability. These disruptions prompted companies to rethink their reliance on global suppliers. A 2023 report from the Reshoring Initiative found that 62% of surveyed companies were considering reshoring or nearshoring due to rising costs in China and global instability. The pandemic also highlighted the risks of lean inventory models, which left companies vulnerable to supply shocks. Trade policies and tariffs. Trade policies have further accelerated the push for domestic production. The U.S.-China trade war and subsequent tariffs on Chinese goods have made importing more expensive. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, enacted in 2020, incentivizes regional production by offering tariff-free trade for goods meeting strict rules of origin. Since USMCA's implementation, foreign direct investment in North American manufacturing has grown 134%, with 53% of Mexico's FDI in 2023 directed toward manufacturing. However, tariffs on Mexico and Canada, proposed by the Trump administration in 2025, have created uncertainty for brands relying on cross-border supply chains. Consumer demand for sustainability. Consumer preferences are also driving change. A growing number of Americans prioritize sustainability, transparency, and ethical production, fueling demand for made in USA clothing. Brands like Patagonia and Reformation have built loyal followings by emphasizing eco-friendly materials and local production. In a 2024 survey, 39% of fashion executives noted increasing consumer interest in sustainable apparel, pushing brands to adopt organic cotton, recycled materials, and circular economy practices. Case study: Reformation's shift. Reformation, an LA-based brand, initially produced most of its clothing locally using deadstock fabric. However, as the brand scaled, it faced challenges with domestic capacity and moved some production overseas. Today, about 20% of its products are made in the U.S., limited by the lack of domestic infrastructure for large-scale production. This case illustrates the tension between consumer demand for local goods and the practical challenges of scaling domestic manufacturing. Innovations driving the resurgence. Automation and technology. Technological advancements are making domestic production more viable. Automation, AI, and robotics are reducing labor costs and improving efficiency. Companies like Software Automation are developing "sobots" that use computer vision to sew garments, addressing the shortage of skilled labor. 3D knitting and robotic cutting systems allow for precise, small-batch production, aligning with consumer demand for customization. Microfactories, small, highly automated facilities, are also gaining traction, enabling brands to produce on-demand orders quickly and sustainably. Sustainable practices. Sustainability is a key driver of the textile resurgence. American manufacturers are adopting eco-friendly materials like organic cotton and recycled polyester, as well as water-saving dyeing processes. Textile-to-textile recycling startups are building large-scale plants in the U.S. Though many recycled materials are still shipped abroad for processing due to limited domestic capacity. California's recent law requiring brands to fund textile recycling infrastructure could spur further innovation. Regional supply chains. The USMCA and CAFTA-DR trade agreements are strengthening regional supply chains. In 2023, North American trade reached $1.57 trillion, with Mexico and Canada as the U.S.'s top trade partners. U.S. textile manufacturers export 70% of their products to the Western Hemisphere, leveraging yarn-forward rules that require regional sourcing for tariff benefits. However, the U.S. faces a bottleneck in fabric production, with only 38 fabric mills in the OTEXA database, limiting fully integrated domestic supply chains. Case study: America Knits. America Knits, based in Swainsboro, Georgia, is a modern success story. The company has invested in automation and sustainable practices to produce high-quality garments for brands seeking "Made in USA" labels. By partnering with local cotton growers and using advanced knitting machines, America Knits exemplifies how technology and regional sourcing can revitalize small-town economies. Challenges to scaling domestic production. High labor costs. Labor costs remain a significant barrier. A U.S. worker earns $15 to $16 per hour, compared to a monthly wage in Bangladesh. This disparity makes large-scale production economically challenging, particularly for fast fashion brands. Small-batch production for premium or niche markets, like luxury or workwear, is more viable, but scaling to meet mass-market demand requires significant investment. Skilled labor shortages. The decline in vocational training has left a shortage of skilled workers in sewing, pattern making, and textile production. The aging workforce and lack of interest among younger generations exacerbate the problem. Manufacturers are addressing this through training programs and partnerships with educational institutions, but rebuilding the talent pipeline will take time. Limited infrastructure. The U.S. lacks sufficient fabric mills and processing facilities to support a fully integrated supply chain. Only 13% of textile output in 2019 went to woven fabrics, and 5% to knit fabrics, compared to 18% for fibers and yarns. This bottleneck forces many brands to rely on imported materials, undermining "Made in USA" claims. Policy uncertainty. While government incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act and USMCA encourage domestic production, proposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada create uncertainty. Manufacturers need long-term policy stability to invest in infrastructure and workforce development. Ferrara Manufacturing. Ferrara Manufacturing, a New York-based producer for Ralph Lauren and the U.S. military, has seen increased interest in small-batch production. However, CEO Joe Ferrara notes that scaling requires significant capital and policy support, which are currently insufficient. The future of "Made in USA." Opportunities for growth. Despite challenges, the future of American textile manufacturing is promising. Consumer demand for sustainable, locally made products continues to grow, with brands like Patagonia and Theory leveraging "Made in USA" branding to differentiate themselves. Niche markets, such as luxury, activewear, and adaptive clothing, offer opportunities for small-scale, high-value production. Policy recommendations. To support the resurgence, policymakers should increase incentives, expand tax credits and subsidies for domestic manufacturers, similar to the $2.1 billion allocated for low-carbon materials under the Inflation Reduction Act. Invest in workforce training, fund vocational programs to rebuild skills in sewing, pattern making, and advanced manufacturing. Strengthen fabric production, provide grants to establish new fabric mills to address the supply chain bottleneck. Leverage trade agreements. Encourage greater use of USMCA and CAFTA-DR to boost regional exports, which accounted for 70% of U.S. textile exports in 2021. The role of technology. Advancements like AI, automation, and digital textile printing will continue to lower costs and enable customization. Companies like Unspun and Ministry of Supply are using these technologies to produce tailored garments on demand, reducing waste and appealing to eco-conscious consumers. Consumer education. Educating consumers about the benefits of slow fashion, durability, quality, and environmental impact, can justify higher prices for domestic goods. Brands must also highlight transparency and ethical labor practices to build trust. Case study: Patagonia's sustainable model. Patagonia has invested heavily in sustainable practices, using organic cotton and recycled materials while maintaining some U.S. production. Its commitment to transparency and environmental stewardship has made it a leader in the industry, inspiring other brands to follow suit. Conclusion. The resurgence of American textile manufacturing is a story of resilience, innovation, and adaptation. Supply chain disruptions have exposed the risks of global dependency, while consumer demand for sustainability and "made in USA" products has created new opportunities. However, challenges like high labor costs, limited infrastructure, and skilled labor shortages require coordinated efforts from manufacturers, policymakers, and consumers. This episode of Made in America, the supply chain revolution has shown that the textile industry is at a pivotal moment. Brands like Reshaping, Patagonia, and American Knits are leading the way, leveraging technology and regional trade agreements to rebuild domestic production. Yet, scaling this resurgence will require significant investment in infrastructure, workforce training, and policy stability. As one industry leader put it, it's going to take a substantial investment and rethinking of how we train, value, and build supply chains to bring more production back. The future of "Made in USA" textiles is not just about economics, it's about reclaiming a piece of America's industrial heritage, ensuring national security, and meeting the demands of a new generation of conscious consumers. By embracing innovation and collaboration, the U.S. textile industry can weave a new chapter in its storied history.